All right, welcome back to another week for the Dalten Weekly Hangout. So we don't have any news on the Dalten Collective so much. There's a little action on Twitter that I thought was fun. So if you wanted to see what that's about, go ahead and check out @_Dalten, TEN, of course, and see whether there's some conversation about happening on Twitter about Urbit in general and about collectively owned addresses, which was interesting. So we haven't made any other updates. We haven't made any progress on the trust metric, and we're still in the same place we were last week, which is to say we are a legal entity now, and we can start taking other kinds of contracts in sort of a legal setting. But the last few weeks, we've had a few different people on talking about the public key infrastructure for Urbit. First, we had Ted Blackman on, also known as Ravnes Rickfer, and then we also had Phil, who is WikDev Wisret, talking about more long-term things about how to address a public key infrastructure that's not as dependent on a third party, in this case, Ethereum, but maybe something a bit more internal, but also giving us the same kind of guarantees that we would want from a consistent, available, Byzantine fault tolerant, that kind of thing. However, this conversation all started when gas prices started to spike, and it was framed in two sorts of in a two-pronged manner, meaning there's something we should and could do now in order to address gas prices to make it easier for people to join Urbit, and then there's a long-term thinking. Most of the conversation has happened around the long-term thinking, not as much as happened around the short-term and what we can do right now. So I invited Galen to come on to talk about what it is that we could do right now to address gas prices, adoption of the network, and pretty much anything else anybody wants to ask. So Galen, when you open this conversation up on Google Dev or the Urbit Dev on the Google groups, you kind of framed it like that. Like there's some things that we should be thinking about right now. What are the things that we can be thinking about right now in terms of mitigating high gas prices on Ethereum, and what that might have as an effect on adoption for Urbit in general?
Yeah, good question, or that's the question I was originally trying to get people to talk about. So to maybe frame it at a slightly higher level, basically like Urbit, if Urbit is useful, address space is valuable because people will pay to use something that is useful generally. And the capture of that value by the different entities who own Urbit address space means that we can make Urbit more useful. And that's kind of the basic feedback loop involved. The simpler way to think about it, or like one example I've always liked is like, look, if IP address space was owned by the people who developed the internet, then they could have, ICANN and related entities wouldn't be these kind of strange background organizations. They'd have like real power in shaping how this infrastructure works, instead of it basically being dominated by big companies whose interests we have to be suspicious of, and so on. So anyway, I think of the address space, this sort of cycle of like, as Urbit becomes more mature and more people want to use the address space or want to use Urbit, the address space is this important component of that. They have to acquire address space. So as people get interested in doing whatever it is that they're doing in DeFi space, which is obviously it's not necessarily orthogonal to what we do, but it's somewhat parallel, or, it's like related, but slightly different. Regardless, the usage, right, just causes gas prices to spike, which means that getting on the network is really, really hard. And we're in a funny spot because we use Urbit every day. The community uses Urbit every day. Like Urbit's relatively nice to use. And we're at a point where it would be nice to be able to go and ask other people to get on the network because the system is nice to use. But of course, now that's going to cost you. I think we managed to spawn a couple of planets for $16, but at certain points it'll cost upwards of $100 just to get an address going. And of course, you're not paying the person who's selling the planet, right? You're paying the Ethereum network for actually registering the transaction. So that's a big problem, basically, because it means no one's gonna. It's a completely halts, any further adoption of the network, which also kind of just stops the growth of Urbit in some. Not completely, but it's a real threat. In the long term, it would be totally existential if we did nothing. I think, if you're just like, what, getting on the network costs $100. simply because I think you wouldn't be able to. It should certainly be that someday, a planet is worth $100. You easily pay $100 to use Urbit because it's fantastically useful and you get to keep it forever. But in the early days, that's a really high price to pay. So anyway, yeah, I think it's likely that this problem is not going away, which means that we need to consider how we're going to host our PKI. We always knew that Ethereum was likely a bootstrapping mechanism. It was like a great first start. You get the benefit of a global network. It's like extremely censorship resistant. There are huge benefits to using Ethereum, actually. And I think we sort of used it in the right way. But anyway, we have to work around this both for now and in the long term. So anyway, yeah, I'm just repeating some of what you said. So my perspective, it's like I want us to continue to grow. I also just want people to be able to use what we're making. Like I like using this thing. I want to be able to onboard my friends to it. And I'm like, well, great. Now I actually literally cannot do it. So I was definitely most concerned with, all right, how can I do this as quickly as possible? And my original thinking, Philip and I it's all just started in a bunch of conversations between Philip and I and Ted and I and a few other people, but just trying to think through, okay, is there any way that how could we get around this? So the dumbest solution is spawn a bunch of planets. Actually, this is maybe not obvious. It's funny because I'm almost like reticent to talk about it because I don't want anyone else to exploit it this way. But basically, gas prices fluctuate throughout the day depending on, whether sushi is like trending or whatever. I don't understand why. When Asia is awake or something, I actually really, it looked for a while like it was actually like, in the middle of the night. It's actually in the middle of the night US. So maybe it's just finance bros who are, super involved in DeFi go to sleep for an hour and gas prices plummet because network activity plummets. So I thought, all right, let's just get all of our invites through. We'll start pre-spawning planets. So we can have them. And that's the dumbest possible thing you can do. The second thing I was thinking about is basically like, what we want is to be able to get people on the Urbit network, and we want them to have a name that is reasonably memorable. And we have affordances for that, specifically one just that you could issue a moon, right? So my planet can issue a moon. Moons are not registered on chain. There's so many of them that would never make sense as chain state. And that would let us just go around this, right? We could host those people, or we could make their onboarding really simple. And, we would be compromising on the permanence of their identity, right? Because if the planet ever breached or went away, that would, they'd have to reissue keys to them or something to that effect. But it lets people try out the system, which is good. So following this, thinking through this, the next step is like, well, okay, is there any way you can make that permanent? Or can you kind of get closer to maybe a concept like, I'm going to give you a promise of a future planet. I can't give you a planet today. And either gas prices are going to go down, or someone's going to pay for it in the future, or we're going to move to a chain where the gas price is not an issue and we'll simply register you. But we'll just make some kind of promise, and you can use that promise to get on the network. And then eventually you can kind of cash that promise in for a planet itself. And so that's what my original thread, if you want to go read the background, right? There's a thread on Urbit Dev that I started being like, hey, let's talk about the near term, how we're going to fix this now, and the long term, maybe we need a different chain or something to that effect. Let's talk about the near term. Everyone went and talked about the long term. Long term is, I think, is probably more interesting, that is a deeper rabbit hole. It's interesting. And the near term is in some ways less interesting and actually involves compromises that are annoying. Anyway, so we went and explored that rabbit hole a bit, and I was like, all right, look, here's a concrete proposal on the near term, which is similar to what I described just now. It's kind of like, here's a way we can make a promise of a future planet, which we're calling Planetoids. And I can get into the specifics of what that is. I think it's promising. It's a promising promise because it lets us get around this issue in the near term. It makes some compromises that can be concerning, and we're still talking about it. Although I think I've been around the argument enough times that I'm starting to be more convinced of it, but it's not done. It's not a completely done deal. So anyway, you should lead really. We can talk about the specifics of the proposal, what exactly it is, and then maybe get into some of the compromises.
Yeah, let's talk about Planetoids, because I've seen some of the conversation around this, and one big concern that I had, or at least that I saw from Timlook, was that the security model for Planetoids, or moons really, What would that be? Like,
Yep.
could they access each other's, scry each other's state? What kind of affordances do moons give? Let's start right there.
Yeah, so
like security question.
we wouldn't use, so the Planetoid, let me just describe the solution,
Yeah.
or the proposed solution, because we actually wouldn't use moons for some of the reasons that Tim pointed out. Although those could be changed, that could be dealt with at the Arvo level, but I actually think this is simpler. So a Planetoid is basically an attestation signed by the management proxy of a star that says, I promise to give you such and such a planet. You could literally make it that English phrase signed by that key, as long as everyone uses the same phrase. Then you, as the Planetoid owner, renter, you don't own this thing. I think this is one of the important things. It's this, temporary. I mean, it's really just a promise. You, as the holder of this promise, right? You don't own the planet. You can use it to boot onto the network. So this means that what would change Arvo to, if I own a Planetoid, or I'm using a Planetoid and you have a planet, and we want to talk, first you would say, hey, does anyone know where ravmel-ropdyl is? And your star, whoever is basically your star first, would say, let me look at the chain, because star has a cache version of the chain, of the azimuth state from the chain, and say, well, this guy's not registered on chain. Why don't you go talk to his star? And so then you go and talk to my star and say, hey, do you know what's up with ravmel-ropdyl? Is he a Planetoid? And the star would say, yeah, he's a Planetoid. I issued it. These are his keys. So your star would hold the key state. That key state would be just held inside of Arvo. It's not reflected on chain. The value of that attestation is that we would also upgrade azimuth such that you can take that attestation and you can basically claim the planet that you were promised. So you could go to the spawn function and you could say, hey, Samza promised me ravmel-ropdyl, give me ravmel-ropdyl, and it would do it, like unilaterally. The issue, of course, is that if your star rotated keys, it would invalidate those attestations. So it could both, quote unquote, double spend a Planetoid. I think this is, if you don't think about it as something that is owned, it's not a double spend because it was never an owned asset to begin with. But it could be confusing for people who are using these things, right? Because all of a sudden you're like, oh, I had this identity, it's gone. That's the downside of it. The upside of it is, well, you were promised this thing, and if you wanted to exit and go do it, you could do it. Maybe someday your host would do it for you or whatever, but you do have this risk, it's like compromise. Anyway, we can get into that compromise, but that's more or less how the systems work, or how the system is described to work. So this lets us basically, you could sign batches of these things really quickly, obviously, because you don't have to register them on chain. You could offer them to people as kind of like, you want to alter the interface and so on to make it really clear, like, this is a temporary planet. We've been trying to think of, I think a lot of it has to do with like the language that you use. Like, this is a non-verified account. I don't know what exactly is the right thing to do. There's part of this that I like because it sort of feels like, well, we want to try and onboard a lot of people. Talon's working on hosting. We want to be able to let people use our hosted service. Some of those people may churn. So it seems okay to me to say, hey, try this out. If you like it, you should register your ownership, and we should make it clear in the interface. Like, this is sort of a trial thing. You get to keep, you can, solidify your ownership of this thing if you want to go register it on chain and make sure that interface is really clear. It is admittedly, not as simple as just saying, hey, this is yours, which is obviously preferable, but also basically practically impossible. So in its current implementation. Anyway, I'm already starting to, as you can see, there are compromises that are worth discussing, and it's hard not to get into them right away. But that is, system is basically star writes these attestations, the network respects them, and then we alter the contract such that they can actually let you claim the thing.
Great.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and actually this might be a nice introduction to some folks watching about what claims are and how they might even work, since they haven't been really utilized in any sort of way on the network to date. So what is a claim? How does it work?
Yeah, so we wouldn't use the azimuth system of claims, although it is an important feature of the system. This would just be like a claim in the cryptographic sense. So basically, I use my private key, in this case, the management proxy. Or no, I think we actually use the spawn proxy. So when you own an Urbit-ID, we encourage you to, we have kind of like an embedded key structure. so that you can separate higher value keys from lower value keys. You have an ownership key, a spawn key, a voting key in the case of galaxies, and a management key. I forget something. I feel like I'm forgetting one.
Yeah, that's it, I think.
Close enough. Wait, is it spawn? Yeah, I think that's it. Anyway, the ownership key can revoke all of the other keys. So the thinking is sort of like, get that ownership key sharded, distributed, very safely secured, such that if any of your other keys are compromised, you can reset it with a key that you have in very cold storage. Spawn key is obviously a high value key. That's what you spawn other addresses with. So for stars and galaxies, these are super high value. You can actually issue other addresses with them. That should be also quite secure, although you're going to need to use it from time to time to spawn addresses. And your management key is what you use to actually initialize the thing on the network. So in the case of Planetoids, the type of claim that we're talking about is just, I use the private key of my spawn proxy, meaning I have to, which obviously should be in the custody of the star owner, to sign a statement. So you can just, take any key and go through the same signing process that you would when you sign a certificate or so on. Just, take a plain text string, sign it using some particular algorithm, you get, a hash-like output that then could be verified on the other end. So if I know the plain text of what you signed, I can verify, did this public key in fact sign, with this such and such plain text. So that's the magic of cryptography that we can use to our advantage to basically, have another party verify when you say, hey, here's my Planetoid cert, basically. It was signed by Samzad. Someone else can say, you're right, that is in fact signed by Samzad. I believe you to be who you say you are. Azimuth has a system of claims or attestations. What are normally called attestations, we call claims, which are basically just like statements that you can attach on chain to any Urbit-ID to, make public any statement that you want to associate with the Urbit-ID. We initially thought of this as probably the most basic way of doing a reputation system. So other people you could make claims about other nodes on the network, or you could make individual claims, key-based style, maybe about like, this is who I am in other places. One thing that I proposed actually, which I think I'm not in favor of anymore, but it's still interesting to think about, is using claims to sort of validate. Oh, okay, sure. Oh, yeah, right, sorry. Claims, and there is a separate contract for, Mark's pointing out there's a separate contract for reputation it's basically a subset of claims, right? It's just effectively like it's almost like a karma score, like a super simple reputation. It isn't like a plain text, whereas claims are some plain text claim that I think we imagined as being potentially useful key-based style. You can correct me, although I always get confused trying to read the chat.
Yeah, the way censures works is it just lets infrastructure nodes, so like stars and galaxies, say that, oh, this person, like this ship identity is a bad actor,
right?
And then they like flag that in the contract. Like it's not really a claims kind of situation in that way.
Right. It's like a sort of more formalized claim, like not a plain text claim.
Yeah, it's just like it's I wouldn't call them claims because the contract is built specifically for the purpose of like storing negative reputation flags, essentially.
Got it. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I forgot about the fact that it's all. Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I forgot about that. Anyway, let's see. So yeah, one thing I was suggesting was that we use claims, not censures, to sort of authenticate Planetoid issuers. Because one of the concerns about this model is that you'd have people selling Planetoids as if they were planets, which they obviously aren't, and then reselling the planets on OpenSea or similar, and effectively exploiting what looks like a double spend. So I was saying, well, what if you made it such that in order to even be allowed to issue Planetoids, such that, Arva would say, when you ask for ravmel-ropdyl, it's like, well, I don't see him in the chain, and it looks like Samzad is a Planetoid issuer, so you can ask Samzad. Or the inverse, he's not in the chain, Samzad not a Planetoid issuer, he doesn't exist. And one way you could do that is to have galaxies either vote or collectively sign, sort of attestations to the effect of, we believe Samzad is an okay, individual to issue planetoids. This was where this requires us to descend down another rabbit hole, which is basically why the double spend problem could be exploited here. And I think it's more of almost like a social question. Like, do you expect people to exploit this? And should you put limitations on our ability to issue planetoids, and how should you do it? I think I've come around to thinking that the original system in its simple implementation is probably fine for what we need it for, being just like a way to let more people on the network as quickly as possible. But we can certainly game that out. I've spent a lot of time doing that the last couple of days, trying to think about what the risks are.
Okay, well, because a few of those kind of come to mind immediately. One of the obvious ones was, let's say I'm Samzad, and either on purpose or by accident, I issue the same ship to two different people, so they both have valid certificates. How might we address that specific sort of issue?
Well, there's two ways. I mean, so the reality is you can certainly do that. I mean, there are different ways you could do it, and you could always certainly technically do it. So one way would be that you issue a planetoid to someone, they're using it, and then you just decide to issue it to someone else, to a different key. Should be clear that like a planetoid at this, it's just totally conceptually, it's not just, it's like I vouch for this planet, but it's of course I vouch that this planet is owned by such and such a key. Someone still has to have a key pair on their end, right, that they're initializing the planet with. And so you could issue a planetoid to one individual, or like to one key pair, assuming they're individual, and then issue it to another one. There's no way for us, I think, to practically like prevent that. Like it's basically an ordering. I mean, this is why I have blockchain in the first place, right? Like, who's to ensure that ordering? Well, a simple solution to that is use a blockchain. Well, the problem is that blockchain is too fucking expensive, so can't really, that's the trade-off, right? So it could be done as a mistake. It could be done, it could be done maliciously. The other way that it could be done, so in terms of, you could reissue a planetoid to a different key. You could also issue a planetoid and then register the planet on chain, and the chain would always supersede the planetoid. And the reason for that is that you can't tell the difference between someone upgraded it, right, like took the planetoid and went and claimed it, versus the star just issued it themselves. And that's because the chain, of course, doesn't know about the state of Urbit. Like, planetoid state is just contained within jail, within the security driver of Urbit itself. And so in the planetoid case, a similar problem with reissuing a planetoid. It's like, if you gave me a planetoid and then I lost my keys, and I'm like, oh man, can you just issue that again? I'm just going to breach and start over. I mean, how does the system know the difference between, why wouldn't you be allowed to perform a key update? We've gone back and forth, and that's kind of a detail. You could say that planetoids only get to be issued once, and you just have to issue a new one. The idea is that this is an affordance for basically providers, like anyone who wants to onboard people. So in the onboarding case, you shouldn't be, planetoids shouldn't need to cycle keys, because you should be caring for them in a different way. And if you want to cycle your keys, pay the gas costs and then get yourself a real planet.
I have two questions off of that. So first, on the attestations and the prevention of double spending the attestation just from a star to a planetoid, like giving the same planetoid away multiple times, could the galaxies who have authenticated different stars as planetoid givers also record those givings so that you lose that opportunity? Is that a potential solution, or is that non-workable?
Well, you sort of start to step toward what we think a longer-term solution here looks like, which is like some form of a roll-up or side chainy thing, right? Which is basically like, we want there to be a source of truth that's mirrored between a bunch of nodes. Maybe those. This is we've been down there. Every time I have this conversation, you sort of start to do this again. You're like, okay, what we really want is a way to register all the planetoids, and then we should start ordering them somehow with the galaxies, and then we should start registering that chain. Sorry, I guess I've been through this. We should walk through it, but I've been through this so many times now that I'm like, I can like see them coming or something. It's not a bad idea. So this is kind of part of why I was thinking, oh, maybe you could do this thing with galaxies, just doing the simplest version of this idea of like galaxies, like sort of attesting or like, lending some reputation to the Planetoid dealer instead of actually, the full-fledged version of that, would be say, every Planetoid dealer needs a certain number of galaxies to basically mirror their transaction state and act as their kind of like parallel database. But what we're going for here is also engineering simplicity. Like, if engineering costs nothing, then we would switch to a different block. If engineering could be done quickly and ultra efficiently or whatever, then we would just switch and use some other solution. So what we're looking for is something that, we could implement on the order of 4 to 6 weeks. I mean, you want to do this now, basically. So the dumber, the better. So anyway, I think there's something to that, and it's interesting, but it's a question of how long do you want the stopgap to last for, which actually, I guess I haven't most things that people ask me about publicly over and over, I have like a good spiel for. In this case, it's not the case. But in terms of like just setting the scope for what we're trying to do, it's like trying to solve the inviting problem. We concede there's probably a long-term solution that's between 9 and 18 months away. So you're trying to basically create a stopgap for that amount of time. And you don't expect this to last forever. That's super important. And you want to implement it as soon as possible. If you could implement it yesterday, you should. So anyway, of course you can't. And you're trying to think about, well, how long, what's the trade-off there? How complicated am I willing to stomach, and how long does that cost?
So that's a great answer. And I see how it, like the first proposal there goes down that slippery slope towards a long-term solution without giving yourself the time that you need to actually roll that out. And so that kind of, my other question was, could we remove the incentive to double spend by, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but my understanding was that there's always the possibility for stars to issue moons and not planets. Could you, like they were called dark moons in some of the documentation, could you turn on moons for the stars so that they're totally worthless, but give people a taste of they're worthless in the sense that the ownership of those keys always stays with the star. So we know that there's no incentive to double spend those as a stopgap to get people on the network and maybe incentivize them to buy in through the Ethereum chain. But either way, giving people an onboarding ramp until you get to that other solution.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there are two things about, and this is broadly, whether they're the moons of stars, which I think actually it's like, there's like one galaxy that has planets basically or something like that. I can't remember. There's like there's some dark areas of outer space. They're very small little corners of the universe. So whether they're the moons of stars, whether they're the moons of planets, or whether they're comets, there are two issues. One of them just maybe like a design issue or a user experience issue, and one of them technical. So the design or user experience issue to me is that it's really weird I don't know how to explain to someone, hey, welcome to this cool new platform where you own everything and it's designed to last for a long time. You have this name, kind of hard to remember, and you should probably set a nickname, and it might change eventually, and it's not really yours anyway, but you should probably get it's just like it's like a weird story. Like, I don't get it. It just doesn't, as a designer, I'm like, I don't know, you might be able to do it, but it's very complicated. We have talked about, as Matilda pointed out, same thread, like this idea that maybe there should be a way that you could like boot a comet just to play with Urbit, and eventually you get a planet. I think that's interesting. Like, there's an interesting user experience thing that should be handled there maybe, which is like just trying to onboard people really quickly. I don't think we're there yet, but I could see that happening eventually. And like maybe you let people do a few things in the UI, but you restrict it a little bit so they don't encounter what I think is the harder part, which is a technical problem, which I tried to point out briefly in this is like it's like one of those like MMA podcasts, except like I'm just recounting like an email chain. But anyway, like the problem that I think is most concisely described by like, okay, let's say I boot a comet, let's say I boot a moon. And, you know, as Polek, Tonteg, Patnus, Rigtine, I joined a bunch of groups and I talked to people for a week. And then I decided to get a planet. And my planet is, you know, Tidril Tabpub. So, you know, the way that the way Urbit actually works is like when I joined all those groups and sent all those messages, they got copied to everybody else's shit. And now they're in there as Polek, Tonteg, Patnus, Rigtine. So now that I have upgraded myself into this totally different planet name, how do people know that that was me? And I mean, sure, it's like, I can imagine technical means by which you would make that update, but like, first of all, it's a little bit complicated and ugly. And it's, the whole thing is that this is a hack to begin with. I mean, we don't even want to do this. So if you're going to have to hack it, it's got to be a Band-Aid. You better just keep the Band-Aid small. And second, it's like, I mean, I think it's the same. It's just like, it's a feature you don't want. You don't even really want it to exist. So let's not let that like creep into the system. It's basically my, you're going to like take on all this like Arvo level work to make an affordance that you don't really want to have. Whereas I do think, the hinge of the Planetoid issue when it comes to like double spending these things is like, you should never sell. This shouldn't be something that you would ever sell. So, the reason that I don't think I think it would actually be hard for people to sell them is that I think that they aren't actual cryptographic property. And so the structure of those keys and key files are going to be more like an individual text file and not like something you can hold in MetaMask. So when I think about, okay, well, who's the person who's going to exploit this and start selling Planetoids? I mean, it's going to take a lot of work to actually set up a Planetoid store or whatever. And like, once you've done that, I mean, it's better to keep your reputation, right, than to burn it. For what's the trade-off there? Like, if everyone's paying you for Planetoids, ideally you're also hosting them. At what point is it worth it to go double spend all your customers and screw them? I think it's actually reasonably high. I mean, it's got to be over like a couple $100 or something. You know, I don't know. You'd have to do a fair bit of volume before it's worth it, and even then, it's not really worth it, I don't think. I mean, people are worried about this, but I just tend to think that the way it's a big question of how it's handled, meaning like how we implement it. I mean, it's just like, how will we describe these things, integrate them into the interface, and like explain what they are. That's my feeling. I think it's like, just thinking about it as an asset to begin with is not correct. It is not something that you actually own. It's basically like, it's like an invitation code. And if you want to really claim it, you need to go and claim it. It's like something you could use to register a planet. And it gives you kind of like trial access to the network, which could, you can retain for some amount of time.
And Galen, do you think there might be value in either requiring or strongly suggesting that any of these, so let's say if there's certificates to issue as well, like for a star, that probably comes down from the galaxies. If they are also required to host, that gives them some skin in the game, less incentive to do what you just said. So if you want one of these Planetoid certificate issuers things, then you have to host as well.
Yeah, so this is what we were talking about a lot yesterday. I kind of go back and forth on this. I think Philip pretty much convinced me that this isn't right. But so the way to think about this idea, I think, is like CAs, right? So it's like, who holds the root keys? ICANN. I think it's like ICANN. You can apply to be a certificate issuer like Komodo or whatever, and then you guys go have beers, and then they give you a certificate or whatever it is. I don't know. They give you some keys that allow you to sign HTTPS certificates, right? So it's a similar idea where it's like, well, you would need to get, 4 or 8 or some number of galaxies to sign something that says, yeah, we think this guy can issue Planetoid. So what would that be? What would then it's, my hope is like, it's like one of these things where you're like, well, you can't, it's like, code is law, but only so much. Like, there are limitations to how you can enforce, like, you can't formalize, you have to be a host, right? You can only formalize someone else said you were a good guy or whatever, right? So what would that what would we expect to happen there sort of socially? And I think it's something like that. It's basically, but this is where I think I sort of started to back away from this. So when you dig into it, it's like, okay, it should only be for people who are providers, but it's also, those providers have to basically keep their nodes online almost indefinitely. And because every time you breach the supernode, if you breach the star, you have to cycle everybody's keys, which means you kind of have to like do good customer service. And can you really ask people that? You know, like, is that real? Like, what do you like have them sign a blood oath on the white paper and like then it's okay? I mean, it just doesn't. It's hard to imagine. Someone suggesting even, you know, you could sure, you could write like legal docs about it, but like, is there really any recourse? And so then I think it comes down to like, look, maybe if you think of it as a feature, you think of it as like, hey, you can invite people into the system with these temporary identities that are upgradable, but they're totally temporary. They can go away. This is not a permanent identity. This does not belong to you. This is not yours. This is effectively like demo mode with the right to upgrade. Think of it like you sign up for Facebook, and if you want to, you can register your Facebook identity and never, ever have it taken away from you. Like, that's cool. Like, that's a real feature. But if you think of it like it's an asset that can be double spent, well, then it's a horrible feature. Like, then it's a disaster. So anyway, I don't know if there's any way to really do that. But yeah, the problem we're trying to solve is basically like, excuse me, for us or anybody else who's trying to act as a provider, you want like an easy on-ramp.
I've been sort of investigating this problem for quite some time. First of all, sorry for being late. I had a client meeting.
Cool.
So I mean, I've been thinking about this quite a bit because originally Christian Lingalis sort of like loosely like tasked me with figuring out bulk planet sales.
Yeah.
But this was like right at the moment when gas fees started to get insane, and so like I was like, I originally had like a Merkle sort of bundle type of thing that would have worked if gas fees were low, but like not anymore.
Yeah. I've seen this. We haven't talked in a while, but I'm familiar with what you've been doing, which seems promising. Yeah. And like related to like some of the long-term solutions might end up being.
Right. So, I mean, it was kind of like, it's kind of like a loose roll up, you know, it's not quite like what is it, like the soft roll up, or what did Philip call them? It's different.
Optimistic roll up.
Lazy roll up or something.
Yeah. It's not similar to that. But I mean, what sort of like, what I originally thought of was doing something slightly similar, because like one of the ideas was like in that case, it was kind of like you basically have to like spend like a bunch of transactions to build up these bundles, but then once you have these bundles, you can like move them around in like a bulk type of thing. One way to get around that was kind of locking a star in a contract and having galaxies sign off on a Merkleization of like all the planets. And so you can go ahead and like pre-spawn planets like to an extent, and then like you can finally close out and settle and claim it by providing a Merkle proof for that. And so galaxies sort of like initialize the bundle, and then if you're going to pull something out of the bundle, you just like provide a proof, and then the planet gets spawned.
So is that you would give the proof, when you say provide a proof, it's like if someone wants to buy a planet out of my bundle, I provide a proof to the buyer, or they somehow create the proof, and then the planet gets spawned to them?
The proof. The thing would be is like you would basically have to like spawn it out of the bundle and sell it.
Okay, got it. Yeah. So you'd spawn it out of the bundle and then rekey it to the buyer.
Right, and then you would and then you would basically like you would spawn it by providing a Merkle proof, and then you just like keep all this data off chain, which isn't like super hard to do. You know, but like so something similar would be like if you use something like xdai. I don't know if Kenny's told you much about it.
Just a little, but honestly, I'm like not familiar enough.
So it's basically just like a proof of it's right now it's proof of authority moving to proof of stake, and it's a side chain. You could also do something similar maybe with Matic, which is like more proof of stake. Like it's actually proof of stake right now. It's been around for quite some time. It's built with Cosmos, but it's Ethereum. It's the EVM. It works like you interact with it just like Ethereum. Like you can connect it to your MetaMask and so on, just like xdai. But anyway, so they have these like proof of authority bridges, right?
Yeah.
And so basically, like what you could do in this case is like basically have galaxies basically like sign off on moving things away from the side chain. And so basically, like a star owner would like lock their star up into this bridge contract, and then they could like transfer it off chain, if they want to. Like in order to get it back, you have to have Galaxy sign off on it to get it back on the main chain. And then for like planets, basically it's like the same thing. And then basically like what, like whenever somebody wants to like move it off, like the Galaxy could like sign a new Merkle hash, and then people could claim it on chain. The primary difficulty here, which is like the primary difficulty in general with this sort of thing, is that you like if you want to move a star out of this, and there's like planets that have been spawned on the side chain but not the main chain, you have to pay gas cost to spawn all of those planets, and then like lock them in the contract. Because like people do have those planets on the side chain, and so like you can't like pull your star out of the locked contract without paying for all those planets to make sure that the bridge contract still possesses them.
Yeah, you have to like settle all your liabilities before you like update state.
Yeah, and you'd need
like
two ETH watchers as well. So inside of Urbit, would need to look at two different places to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, this is true. Yeah. But I mean, granted, it would be pretty easy because the RPC is basically the same.
Yeah, all the tooling is the same already too. You can use MetaMask on both chains. They're explorers. Yeah.
I mean, this is in the. I mean, my take on all of these options is that they would require significant changes to azimuth, unless I'm mistaking something.
No, I don't think
no change.
You just need the bridge. You just like
azimuth. You copy azimuth onto xdai, like potentially, 1-for-1, and then there's bridge contracts in between. So if azimuth on xdai sends an asset to the bridge, that's where it lives, and you know what that address is. That's what the galaxies maintain. It's the bridge on both sides.
Yeah, so you just have to write the bridge.
This seems like I just need to understand this a little bit better. But who does and those are contracts that are actually on the Ethereum main chain?
Ethereum main chain and xdai.
Yeah.
So there's a bridge contract on. There's sort of like
it's a portal.
Something happens on the xdai chain. It gets whatever rolled up, Merkleized, like somehow turned into a smaller amount of proof of that state transition that then gets sent to the Ethereum main chain just as a single proof. So it's a very cheap transaction to make. Is that like?
I would say like basically yes, except like only upon exit.
And on exit, meaning when you want to make a change to the main chain, you are required to, or define exit for me.
Like proof of burn or something.
Well, I mean, not exactly. It's like when you would go from xdai to the mainnet.
Yeah.
So it's like I have a planet on mainnet.
Yeah.
And so then what I would do is I would transfer my planet to the xdai bridge contract, and that would get locked up in like a proof of authority bridge by the galaxies. And then I would move then to the mainnet, Yeah, and then I'd move to the main net. And the way that I'd move to the main net is then like the galaxy would sign a transaction, unlocking my planet and allowing me to claim it on the main chain.
Wait, sorry, did you start out? I think you're gonna. The only way that I'm gonna understand things like this is to step through them incredibly slowly. So you're issued a planet on X. Like, no, it's fine. It's interesting. I don't want to. I mean, maybe it's interesting for someone to watch too. I'm like, it actually might. I feel like I would watch this, so I guess we should keep going.
Yeah,
because it would help me understand. Okay, so I think I've lost the thread with you're like, first instead of issuing planets on the main chain, that's expensive. You issue planets on a side chain, and then in order to sort of formalize your ownership of that, if you ever wanted to, this is actually similar in spirit to what I'm describing. The way that you would do that is through a bridge contract that then basically like somehow that shows proof of the existence of that planet on the xdai chain. So when you come back with the keys that you use to own the planet on xdai, that's verified through this bridge contract, and then you can claim the planet on the main chain.
Mm-hmm.
Something to that effect. Yeah.
It's also
but
important.
Then what's the?
You have to move them all. Nothing exists natively on the sidechain. They have to move from the single point of truth, meaning azimuth. They have to move into xdai.
Right. So what you would do is like.
Okay, this is why you would bundle them. So you'd say like on azimuth, I'm going to like lock up all these planets.
Yeah.
And then let them do what a lot of things are going to. Who knows what's going to happen to them on xdai or Matic or whatever. And then if we ever wanted to sort of reify them, the ownership that occurred on xdai, which occurs with same key format, I would basically just have to pay the gas cost to finalize that ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Although I realized something, like you couldn't transfer a star like arbitrarily. Like you can't because the main thing is if you already have planets spawned on the main chain, you need to enforce those constraints on the side chain.
Yep.
But I mean, you still could do that. Like what I would then maybe do is you don't have people actually possess a whole star on the side chain. You wrap it in a contract, and then basically when you move from the main chain to the side chain, you lock your star in the main chain bridge contract, and then it stays in the sidechain contract, but it still allows you to rekey, set management proxies, set spawn proxies, and so on. But then, in order to spawn, basically, it would first check the Merkle proof. It would first check the Merkle proof on the main that was published when you moved your star from the main chain. And so basically when you move your star over to the side chain, you would Merkleize all of that star's planets, showing which ones have been spawned on mainnet and which ones haven't. And then when you go to spawn a planet on the side chain, you have to provide a Merkle proof that wasn't spawned on the main chain before. And the way that that happened is the proof of authority bridge. When you move the star to the side chain, would publish that hash. So once you move your star to the side chain, there would be that hash which demonstrates all the planets which have been spawned. And so then you just provide a proof that has been spawned on the main chain in order to spawn a planet.
Yeah, it's probably also the most general solution. You could also simplify it by just saying you can't move a star over that spawned any planets.
Yeah.
I was going to say, why not just only move? Why not, I don't have, high transaction fees for stars and galaxies is fine. High transaction fees for planets is sort of a bummer. And so it seems like you wouldn't need to handle this in the case of the idea that you would say, make some sort of form of a promise. The only thing that a star needs to do on chain is say, hey, I want to, set aside 1,000 planets that I want to be able to spawn, that I'm going to spawn on this other chain potentially. And and you can basically just like commit to some number of planets that you're going to spawn potentially elsewhere. Say that's down on a side chain. Then you just prevent that star cannot be transferred, like can't update its ownership keys until basically that state comes back or something to that effect. Although that's a real pain in the ass if you ever lose your ownership key.
Or if they don't all come back.
Right. Which also the multiple sources of truth thing seems like could be really painful in certain cases.
Yeah, but it could also be kind of a little bit sealed off, meaning it's totally opt-in. So if only 2 stars did this, that's plenty for the short term, right?
Yeah, we have spawn limits on stars though. Worth remembering, right? Stars can only spawn 2,000 planets this year or something like that.
Oh, that's true. Okay, so not quite.
Yeah, you need to do a handful at least. Well, but you need to update azimuth to respect these kind of like bridge contracts that I can't say I understand deeply, but I think I get the basic gist.
Well, not necessarily, because it's just the same way Dalten is owned by a contract. Azimuth respects that. It doesn't care that we don't have a private key.
Oh, okay. So you'd give So you'd basically make basically Maddox the owner of Azimuth or parts of it or something like that, or the owner of the star or something. Is that right?
Well, the contract is owner. Whatever the contract.
Yeah.
Your contract owns it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and actually that's maybe how you would kind of do it.
Wait, so can you do that on a per star? You could do that on a per. So you're like, oh, these 10 stars are actually owned by bridge contracts that are held on another chain.
Yeah, you'd only need one
or that
contract
are, whatever that are
to hold all.
Okay, sure, yeah.
But yeah, and you know what the contract is because it's sort of like a coordination point.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, now I understand this stuff a little bit better.
It's essentially the same way. If you think about it in terms of token and money, xdai, you have all DAI that exists on xdai had to come from Ethereum, and that Ethereum contract, which is DAI, the smart contract, is the single point of truth. But there's an exact copy on the sidechain, so you can move your xdai around super fast.
Yeah.
And you have to go through the same way you came in if you want to put it onto the main chain, which is to say, if you ever want dollars for your xdai, you've got to go back.
Yeah. But I mean, then my other question is like, well, how geographically distributed are the nodes and how many nodes are there? That's like my first question of any secondary chain.
Oh, for xdai?
Yeah.
Well, it's proof of authority, so there's like 20 right now, but they're moving to a broader general proof of stake thing, which is just, however widely distributed that token is, which it's called stake, STAKE. And you can look at that on like CoinGecko or whatever and see what their sort of long-term plans are for making this more scalable. It's essentially very similar to what Ethereum 2 is planning on doing in some sense.
Yeah.
It's just available now.
It's interesting how, I mean, the nice thing about it is that you could probably make something like Bridge and even, it'd be relatively, the way I understood these originally, I thought of the integration as being a lot more difficult. And so given what you're telling me right now, it's like the integration could be it could be obscured basically because you're like, I look at the chain, I look at Ethereum, if this thing is owned by a bridge contract, look at xdai. But like you're using the same keys. There's
same keys, same MetaMask. You can just point it at a different network. So even bridge.urbit.org would work for both chains.
Yeah.
Like we wouldn't even have to change that at all. Because once you change your MetaMask to point to the other direction, it will return the correct data that the website is looking for.
Yeah. And so like the back end, that pays the gas and fires the transactions, you just have to like edit like the URL and that's it.
Yeah. Wait, so okay, here's a question then. You can see why I have to have this whole room, because if I can't walk around while I think about stuff, then it doesn't get thought about. Right, so the bridge contract, so it's basically like, let's say I have a star, I lock it up in the bridge contract, I start spawning planets on a side chain. If I ever want to take ownership back of that star and like basically exit the bridge contract, that bridge contract enforces the, hey, you must settle all of your obligations, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
But how does that work? Like, where's the oracle there? Like, what's the thing that basically is like looking at, is sort of resolving the obligation, or resolving the state of the xdai chain?
That's where you need like a proof of authority thing, I mean, and I would probably do that with galaxies, maybe.
Yeah. So then galaxies themselves, so it's like the bridge contract looks at a particular endpoint of some kind. I don't know. I mean, does it actually point to a URL? I mean, how does that work? Like what is, I mean, it's all right. I should just read the fucking documentation, but I think that's my.
The way that it would work is like, you have your star. I mean, so I mean, I said before, like if you are working with stars that have already been spawned, like you're gonna have to like still have it like wrapped in a contract on the side chain. That way, it can't spawn plants that have been spawned already.
Yeah, so, you could do it, or you could just say it only works for like stars that haven't spawned any planets on the main chain.
Or you could do it that way. Although I don't think that constraint would be very difficult to enforce.
Sure,
but
I'm still confused about the like.
So
how's that work?
The way the bridge works in the first place is that some entity needs to be able to know what the state is on both sides and have rights to both sides. So in this case, you can also think of the bridge contracts as multisigs. So some number of galaxies need to actually attest to the state on one side. And as soon as that threshold is reached, they process the transaction on whichever side based on what they know, because they can see both states. It's not like automated. It's still like,
that's also a stateful operation. Like I'm saying, like that's something that requires galaxies to actually literally, download the state from one chain, and then perform some computation and then produce a signature.
Which they already do that. To have updated networking keys.
Yeah. I'm just thinking back to what I was saying earlier. It's like a question of engineering trade-offs too. Like this is looking relatively similar to some of our longer term possibilities, which I would say this feels like it's pretty simple. It's pretty simple, but there's still a lot of very important. Whenever basically it's like, well, that's not one way. Like just anything that's this cryptographically sensitive in terms of engineering effort, I'm like, 5 to 10 times the amount of time involved, just because it has to be perfect. Like it cannot be. It's just completely impossible. It's broken beyond salvaging, right? If it doesn't work, and so then you're like, it's auditing and all that kind of stuff. Like you just have to. It has to actually. So that what you're just. I think that we've at least gotten to the bottleneck, right? Like. Whatever is, if it is a galaxy, literally, so you're bolting on something that is then looking at both chains. It could be within Arvo, it could not be. And sure, I like the idea that you have some quorum of galaxies. That makes sense. But that's a non-trivial engineering problem. And you're delegating. You also have a security surface area there that's at least deserves thinking about, right? Because then it's like the possibility of compromise is not like a totally gigantic. Geographically distributed network. It's ultimately, it actually then boils down to whoever has galaxies online, and which now there's a few, but there's not as many as you would want. Let's say it's not bad. It's a bad solution. It's more like
and you need cooperation. Like there's no reason we should try to write all of that. Meaning, everybody in the Urbit community. We just go to the people that are already doing this, that already did that work. Be like, what parts do we need to change from your process to make this work for us? That's something
right.
Well, we would get people on the call.
Yeah. Well, I'd be happy to talk to them. Certainly.
All right.
That's for sure. Yeah.
Well, I know some of them, so I can make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, please. Actually, yeah, do. I mean, I'm going to talk to some Cosmos people. I'm trying to talk to the, what are they called? Stark Labs or something?
Yep.
Starkware.
Starkware, yeah. Starkware seems really interesting. I'll talk to anybody. Like, I mean, yeah, I want to talk. But again, I do think of it as like these are all somewhat engineering intensive.
Yes.
I mean, actually, but like this sounds like something that you could get in on the order of 6 months. But I'm still like, you need to do something before then. I think, unless you guys strongly believe otherwise.
I mean, I think this could I think with like a dedicated enough effort, I think you could actually do this pretty quickly. I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't think that there's really all that much complexity here. I mean, I already know how I do the Merkle proofs for the most part. The only thing that I don't have a decisive answer here on is the question of quorum of galaxies or whatever, which is kind of
yeah. Well, that's a architectural question. That's like a somewhat hard question. Anyway, I think this is in the realm of things we definitely would think about and talk about.
Yeah.
I appreciate. Thanks for answering my simple questions or simplistic questions, because yeah, there's stuff about this that I understood from a further distance 20 minutes ago.
There's,
This has been fun, but actually, so Galen, in terms of these kind of conversations, which probably are going to affect or potentially could affect a lot of people. So Dalten Collective does these weekly hangouts. This has been really fun to have lots of different people on to talk about this particular topic, but I'm sure there'll be many more. And then there's a lot of different places, but in terms of how are we communicating as a community, as an Urbit community about these things? Yeah. Do you have any suggestions about that?
That's a good question. Yes. I think Urbit Dev long-form discussion, for long-form discussion, is completely fine and works well, and that the discussion is ongoing there. The thing that I sometimes think, we're not completely off the rails, but the thing that I want to try and figure out how to impose some discipline on is just how we structure the conversation. It's always better if you can be kind of asserting a concrete proposal. So one way those threads can get really confusing is when people sort of interject, they're like, well, what about this? And it's one paragraph. It's just try to be thorough and sort of asserting, it's almost like we should be thinking about it we're trying to revise a proposal, It's if we could at each juncture sort of say here's how it would look if I did it this way. And then you kind of have the comments about that. It's here's how we look. Well, if we change this component, here's the complete proposal again. Anyway, that's a little bit vague, but basically as much as possible, I feel when please pay attention to those threads, respond to them, contribute. And if you can, just try and dedicate, 30 minutes to thinking through the response. It's going to be so much more productive, basically. I think in general, the threads are super high quality. They're super good. I think I just want to kind of recommend that people dedicate time to it if at all possible, because it'll help us move the conversation along. But you guys I don't think the xdai thing came up in passing. Maybe it's even feedback to you. It came up in this way where someone's oh, maybe you can think about this. I'm just now I understand it a lot more. You gotta tell me the whole story, you could even chime in. If you could chime in on that thread with here's what the implementation would look like roughly, just give me 500 words, not 100 words. Then it was so much more helpful, basically. But yeah, I think Urbit Dev is pretty good for this. And if you want to have synchronous discussion, just get on Urbit and join Urbit community. People are pretty much always there, happy to talk about stuff. We could schedule chats there if that's helpful. I feel like the conversation's advancing pretty nicely though. But yeah, that's my take. I don't know.
All right. Well, yeah, I'll get this out today, hopefully, and then let's spread it around so people can make sure that we're all sort of staying in sync with the conversation, since I think we did have some pretty good conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for hosting these. I think it's really good.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
See you soon.
See ya.